be with you today. I haven't been to Holland since 2016. I used to regularly come in the late 1990s and the early 2000s when my good friend, the late Willem van Asselt, was a professor at the University of Utrecht, where I would come to give lectures every 18 months or so. But it's wonderful to be back in the Netherlands. I was telling somebody yesterday that the last time I was in the Netherlands, I was at a conference with Kelly Kapik from Covenant College, and on the Friday night we went for dinner in Amsterdam before flying off on the Saturday. And the restaurant in which we were having dinner burned to the ground while we were there. So I'm hoping that it will be a happier end to my time in the Netherlands this time. I want to give 4 lectures, and I'll give you the broad overview of what I hope to do in these 4 lectures before diving into the first one. The first 3 lectures are going to be attempts to try to explain why so many of the dramatic changes, specifically relating to issues of sexuality and gender, have occurred within the past 15, 20, 25 years. I don't simply, though, want to repeat what I've said in my books. I'm going to be introducing new angles on these issues in order to supplement my argument there. And then in the final lecture tomorrow, the 4th lecture, I want to offer some positive proposals. There is, I think, at this point in time, a great temptation to despair, because the changes are so dramatic and seem to be happening so rapidly. It can be very easy to feel that we are constantly falling away. We're constantly falling behind the rapid changes around us. And I want to suggest, really, coming out of these first 3 lectures, that although the changes are indeed dramatic, although indeed they are occurring with breathtaking speed, in actual fact, they come down to a handful of simple phenomena that we have the resources as churches to address, and that we must not allow the chaos of the big picture to distract us from the everyday task of the church, which I think, to summarize, I might say this: the church going about the task of being the church will answer the questions, the challenges that are being posed to us by modern society. Simply being who we are supposed to be will be sufficient in order to handle the chaotic changes in the world around us. So it's going to be 3 fairly depressing lectures, followed by, hopefully, a hopeful and positive lecture. So the first lecture then, I want to speak about the broad origins and nature of what I call the strange new world. I use the term strange new world because I think for people of my generation, I'm in I would say my late 50s. My wife would say we're in our mid-50s. But those of us in our 50s have seen dramatic changes. If you're in your 50s in this room and you grew up in Europe, as many of us I'm sure did, the first 20 years of your life would have been framed by the Cold War. And the end of the Cold War, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991, marked a dramatic change that was heralded by some as representing the end of history. That free market democracy was going to spread across the globe, and essentially all great developments in history had come to an end. In actual fact, of course, what we've seen since then is the emergence of what I call a strange new world. The kind of way of thinking that I grew up with in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s has been overturned, and politics and society are dominated by issues that were barely on the radar in our youth. The idea, for example, that transgenderism would be one of the most controversial subjects in public life would have seemed utterly bizarre, even 15 years ago. And yet now it dominates public discourse, certainly in the United States, and I think in large parts of Europe as well. We live in a world where our education did not prepare us for the changes that have occurred. And so I want to talk about why these things have happened in the way they have and have happened so quickly. But first of all, I need to introduce a couple of concepts or ideas to help us frame, to help us understand what's going on. I think the very fact that you're at a conference like this indicates that you are probably a person who likes books, a person who likes ideas, a person who likes arguments. And certainly historically within Protestantism, there has been a strong tilt that way. Protestants, we are a people of the book, a people of the word. We tend to think that arguments are very important, and so they are. But we are not solely creatures of argument. And one of the reasons I think that things have happened so rapidly in the last 15, 20 years is not because of arguments. A huge change in the United States in public attitudes to gay marriage occurred between 2005 and 2015. A huge change. Many more people came to think it was a good thing in that decade. They did not do so because they had assessed the arguments for traditional marriage and found them to be wanting. It was not a shift precipitated by argument. It was a shift that occurred in the imagination. Imaginations are much more complicated things than intellects. And I'm very indebted at this point to the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor for his concept of the social imaginary. Now in English, that's a very ugly, awkward term because he's using the word imaginary, which in English is an adjective. He's using it as a noun. I have no idea why he does so, but he does. There it is. The social imaginary, Taylor argues, is that which explains how most people live their lives. In fact, how we all live our lives to a certain extent. What he's trying to get at here is we don't live our lives in accordance with rational arguments. Some areas of our lives we may do so. But in vast parts of our lives, we are driven more by intuition. It's how we imagine the world to be that is critical to how we live, move, and have our being. Ideas and arguments function to some extent in the way we live, but more important are those intuitions, shaped by things like movies, soap operas, situation comedies, television programs, news broadcasts. These are the things that shape how we think about the world. And I want to start today by saying the strange new world has come around not because of arguments, but because of major shifts in the social imaginary. Major shifts in the way we imagine the world to be, connecting to social practices, customs, those big stories we tell ourselves in order to organize the world. And at the heart of the modern social imaginary is the notion of what I call the therapeutic self. What do I mean by the therapeutic self? The therapeutic self is the self, the individual, the way of thinking about the world that sees personal psychological happiness as the be-all and end-all. I can draw this out by drawing a contrast, for example, between my school and the schools my boys went to in the United States. My boys went to what are called public schools in the United States. They're state-funded schools, the local schools. My school was a state-funded school as well. It's what we call a grammar school in England. I think gymnasium would be the German word. Not sure what the Dutch equivalent would be. It was an all-boys school. We all had to wear a uniform. And we had to wear a uniform because going to school was not a matter of self-expression. Going to school was a matter of belonging to the team. That's why at my school, team sports, rugby in the winter, cricket in the spring, were central parts of the curriculum. Education was about having your individuality crushed in order to become part of the team. In fact, my school was founded in the 19th century to train boys from poorer backgrounds to become minor civil servants in the British Empire. That was the philosophy behind it. You became part of the team. If you deviated wearing your uniform, if you had your tie down and your top button undone or your shirt untucked, you would be rebuked by a teacher. I remember walking home one night with my shirt untucked. And the second master, the vice principal, publicly rebuked me off campus for bringing the name of the school into public disrepute. Now, my boys went to a school where there were no uniforms. And any attempt by the authorities at that school to impose any kind of dress code was seen as oppressive and as an attempt to destroy individual expression. Think about that. In some ways, it's a trivial example. In another way, though, it brings out a sea change. In the 40 years between my time at school and my boys' time at school, what has happened? Education has become about individual self-expression. It's become about feeling good. It's become about expressing yourself. That's the therapeutic self. I could use another example. I assume you have the equivalent concept in the Netherlands. Think about job satisfaction. Use this example in my book. I engage in a thought experiment where I asked my grandfather, who was a sheet metal worker in an automobile factory in the Midlands of England. I asked my grandfather if he had job satisfaction from being a sheet metal worker. First thing, I would have to explain to him what job satisfaction meant. He would never have asked himself that question. If I changed the question to, do you think your job was worthwhile? He would have said yes, because it allowed me to put shoes on my daughter's feet and food on the family dinner table. In other words, the job was worthwhile because it allowed me to fulfill my obligations towards those who are dependent upon me. It is nothing to do with whether it makes me feel psychologically good about myself. If you ask me the same question, first of all, I will understand what you mean by job satisfaction. And secondly, I will answer something like this. Yes, I get tremendous satisfaction from my job. I really enjoy teaching young people. I get a buzz out of lecturing to young people. Notice the difference. My grandfather's concept of life, the universe and everything was, can I fulfill my obligations to those who are dependent upon me? My understanding is, does my job make me feel good? That's a major difference in thinking. That's the therapeutic self. And all of the problems we face today, relative to gender, sexuality, etc., they are merely, I would argue, symptoms of that therapeutic self. And that's very important for Christians to grasp, because it hopefully stops us from engaging in the Pharisaical game of starting our discussion of things like LGBTQ matters with the, I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like other men. The Christian's first responsibility, I think, we need to understand how complicit we are in that underlying understanding of what it means to be human, of which sexuality and gender are merely symptomatic. So that's the background then. It's a battle for the imagination. And you might say, well, that makes it more complicated. Actually, I think it's going to make it simpler. But we won't get there till lecture 4. But actually, the fact that it's a battle for the imagination should be a tremendous encouragement to the church. We'll come back to that in lecture 4. How these changes come about? Well, now I want to engage in another thought experiment, not involving my granddad, but going back a little bit further. I want us to go to 3 dates and 3 places and think about what life was like in those places. I want us to go to the 13th century, I want us to go to the 16th century, and I want us to go to today and compare the 3. Okay, so the first date. First date is 1248, more or less the middle of the 13th century. And we're going to go to 2 places in 1248. We're going to go to my home village of Eastham in Gloucestershire, where I was with my mum. My wife and I spent a week with my mother last week. We were in Germany 2 weeks ago. We were in Britain last week. We're here today. I want us to go to Eastham in 1248, middle of the 13th century, and ask what life would be like. Well, first of all, the first thing about Eastham in the middle of the 13th century would be this. The economy is agrarian. The economy is based on agriculture. It would have been fields, it would have been sheep, it would have been cattle. Still a lot of sheep there, actually. My wife and I went for a walk last week, and there were the sheep wandering the hills. But it would have been an agrarian economy, and that's going to be important. What can we say about an agrarian economy? Time is fixed. How do I get there? Time is fixed. Well, if you grow up, as I did, in an agricultural area of the country, you know that the seasons of the year have an absolute authority. The farmer does not get to choose at which point in the year he sows his seed. He does not get to choose at which point in the year he harvests his crops. The seasons have a powerful authority, and it is authority that persists from year to year to year. Time is fixed, very fixed, and very authoritative. Just as before I'm going to talk, I sort of draw some big conclusions at the end of this section. But just think about that for a moment. Think about how you fit into a world where the seasons determine the shape of your life. That's a world where external authority is very easy to believe in. In fact, one might say it's a world where it's impossible not to believe in. You want to sow your seed in the winter and try and harvest it in the spring, you're going to die. You have to follow the rhythm of the seasons. Time is fixed, and year after year after year, that rhythm beats out on a relentless drum of time. Secondly, not only is time fixed, but space is fixed. Our best guess, middle of the 14th century, 13th century, our best guess is that a typical person, a typical Northern European, would not travel more than 40 miles from there where they were born during the entire stretch of their life. In other words, the village you're born in, you can plant the needle point of a compass there, set up a radius of 40 miles, draw a circle. That's your world. That's your entire world. Think about that. Think about that. That's your entire world. Space has huge power because, of course, it takes a long time, and in certain parts of Europe, it can be very, very difficult and dangerous to travel more than a few miles from home. I think I traveled, certainly in going to Heathrow Airport yesterday from Gloucestershire, I traveled 75 miles. I traveled more yesterday morning in 2 hours than the average 13th century Northern European would ever have traveled in their lifetime. A more epic journey. And I did it in 2 hours, and I didn't think twice about it. Then I flew to Amsterdam. And then I think we were driven about 40 miles from Amsterdam to here. It took about 40 minutes, I'm guessing about 40 miles. I engaged in an epic journey that would have been unimaginable to most people in the 13th century. Space is fixed as well. Again, think of how that makes you think about yourself. Remember, we're talking about the imagination here. Space and time are very fixed. You want to flourish, you've got to fit into them somehow. You can't beat them. You have to submit to their authority. Think about communities, though. It's not just space and time. Communities, pretty fixed. Probably, by the time you were 7 or 8, you would have met the person to whom you were going to get married because they'd come from your village or within a fairly narrow radius, small radius of your village. That would be fixed too. Think about your career plans. Well, actually, in the 13th century, you wouldn't have had any career plans because what you were going to do was determined by your birth. Just as King Charles's fate was determined by his birth, so in the 13th century, everybody's fate would have been determined by their birth. Born the son of a peasant farmer, guess what you're going to do when you grow up? You're going to be a peasant farmer. Born the son of the blacksmith, guess what you're going to do when you grow up? You're going to be a blacksmith. When I run this past students at Grove City College, they'll sometimes say to me, but wouldn't that have been frustrating? I say, no. Ambitions and desires are historically conditioned. In 1985, I did not feel the lack of a smartphone as any kind of frustration. It's only once cell phones and smartphones are a real possibility that the lack thereof becomes a source of frustration. Nobody in the 13th century had any concept of choosing a career path. There was not a frustration to them. It was life. But again, think about it. External authority. You don't get to choose who you are. It is given to you, as is the place you live, as is the rhythm of time which you experience. Religion. I love the line. It's a very thought-provoking line in Charles Taylor's great book, A Secular Age, when he says, you can believe the same thing. He's actually talking about 1500, but he says, you can believe the same thing today as people believed in 1500. But you cannot believe in the same way. He said, because you choose to believe in a way that those in 1500 did not choose. Everybody in Northern Europe in 1500, with the exception of small Jewish enclaves, was a Catholic Christian. Now, we can get into discussions about the genuineness of that Christianity, of course, but the point is, religion is not a choice. We choose our religion today. I like to gently pull the leg of my Catholic students by telling them, even you are Protestants today, because you choose to be Catholics. And that's a very Protestant way of approaching Catholicism. You choose it. Religion is fixed. The church is this massive edifice. You're going to be baptized, married, and buried in the same church and churchyard where your ancestors were baptized, married, and buried as well. All of this is to say, in the year 1248, life choices virtually non-existent. Now ask yourself this question, the big question of modernity in some ways. Who am I? That's a really easy question to answer in the 13th century, because you provide virtually no free content to that answer whatsoever. You're the son of so-and-so or the daughter of so-and-so. You're the blacksmith. You live in this place. Pretty much everything about you that is of any social significance whatsoever is something over which you have no power whatsoever. Who am I? Easy question to answer. Why did I pick 1248? Well, the great event for me of 1248, my wife hates me using this illustration, but I'm going to, because she's heard it so many times, but the great event of 1248, of course, is they start building Cologne Cathedral. If you've not been to Cologne, you should go. The cathedral is one of the towering achievements, if not the towering achievement, of medieval Gothic architecture. They started building it in 1248. They suspend building in the 1550s because of the trouble caused by the Reformation. They resume building in the 19th century, and they finish it, I think, in 1880. Over 600 years. Long time. Takes 300 years longer than they planned, probably, because of the Reformation. But one thing we do know is that nobody involved on the first day of building Cologne Cathedral ever imagined they would worship in that cathedral. They were building for the fourth or fifth generation beyond themselves. Just think about that. Another aspect of 13th century thinking is this. It's long term. I would say, why is it long term? Because it isn't about them. Life was never about them. Everything's given. They're just tiny ants in the colony. They're of no real significance as individuals whatsoever. That's 1248. Okay, let's move then to the next date. 16th century, but let's be more specific about time and place. Time, 1522. In fact, we'll be more specific than 1522. We'll say the Lenten period before Easter, 1522. The Lenten fast, 1522. And the place, Zurich, in Switzerland. A meeting takes place in the workshop of a man called Christoph Froschauer. Christoph Froschauer is the preeminent printer of Zurich. If you know anything about the Reformation, you'll know that the relationship between the reformers and the printers was very, very important. You know, the printers simply don't get, as individuals, the credit they should get for the amazing work they do in the Reformation. Martin Luther had a very, very close connection to the printers in Wittenberg, such that he was very careful about what fonts they used for his books. He knew that books and the appearance of books was going to be very important. Well, here we are in Zurich with the great printer of the Zurich Reformation, Christoph Froschauer. He's in his workshop and he gathers his workmen around him. And he invites another individual, a man called Huldrych Zwingli, who many of you will have heard of as the great leader of the theological church reform in Zurich, great opponent of Martin Luther on the Lord's Supper. Zwingli is by this point sort of preacher at large in the city. He's basically the pastor of the city, the religious figurehead of the city. And Froschauer calls Zwingli to this meeting with his workmen. And this is the Lenten fast. And in the Lenten fast, there are very strict dietary restrictions on what you can and cannot eat. And Froschauer decides that he's going to break these dietary restrictions. And he gets a pan and a pile of sausages, and he fries up the sausages, and he and his men eat them. In Zwingli's account of the meeting, Zwingli is very careful to say that he did not eat the sausages. He was merely there to witness the event. Well, you might say, why is this significant? Well, let's think for a moment about what's going on. Let's think about the Wittenberg Reformation. Martin Luther, who is he? Well, by the time 1517 comes around, he's an Augustinian friar. He belongs to a medieval order of brothers. He's a very medieval figure. He gets upset or confused by the selling of indulgences. Won't go into the details here, but it's a medieval church practice connected to purgatory. And so, in order to get clarification on this issue, he does a very medieval thing. He advertises a medieval-style university debate on the notice board outside the local church. He's a medieval man to his finger, a medieval man wanting clarity through medieval means on a medieval practice. The fact that that triggers the Reformation, the birth pangs of modernity, is deeply ironic in a lot of ways. Luther's a medieval man. Zwingli, however, and the Zurich Reformation are very different. The Zurich Reformation starts really in 1522 with the eating of sausages. What's going on here? Well, think about it. Who is Froschauer? Froschauer's a printer. That's a pretty new industry. Mid-15th century, invention of the printing press. Starts to spread across Europe. Printing press will be the technology that disrupts everything. It will fuel a rise in literacy rates. It will transform structures of power. Power will shift from possession of land to ability to handle capital. Froschauer is very much a man of the modern age. And notice what he's doing here. He's challenging the medieval liturgical calendar. Why? Well, if you look at the liturgical calendar of the Middle Ages, it's very agrarian. There's a reason why Christmas occurs in the middle of the year, in the middle of the winter. Farmers don't do much in the middle of the winter. So you can have a party. Not a problem. It's not a problem. Froschauer's men, however, are not agrarian workers. They're printers. Printers can work all year round. Why? Because they have technology that is starting to bend time. Even, we might say, shatter time. The printing press, and it would have been heavy work in the 16th century. None of this sort of word processing, press a button and the printer does it. These were heavy, it was heavy machinery. These were men who needed a proper diet all year round. The agrarian calendar, liturgical calendar of the Catholic Church simply cannot sustain that. You need to eat in Lent. You need to eat properly. I present this to students at Grove and I say, this is an interesting moment when the modern world challenges the medieval world and the modern world wins. The modern world shatters the old world. There is a reason why Sabbatarianism grips the imaginations of the Netherlands and of England in the 17th century. Well, there are various reasons, but one reason is this. It can grip the imagination because the Netherlands and England have the most advanced economies in the world. They are the most free of agrarianism. What do they care for the rhythm of the seasons? What do they care for calendars built around the rhythm of the seasons? You can have a 6 day of labor, 1 day of rest pattern in an advanced economy in a way that is very hard to pull off in an agrarian economy. Time is being refashioned by technology. Space, of course, will come to be refashioned as well. Again, those of you at Dutch Hill know the great rivalry of the 17th century is what? It's the English-Dutch naval rivalry. Spain plays a role, though The English smashed Spain in the late 16th century to some extent. Naval rivalry. Space is getting smaller. Time and space, we might say, are coming under human control. It's becoming possible to imagine that we are not subject to the seasons and to the same geographical restrictions that we always have been. And you see the birth of social mobility. You may not be familiar with English history, but you have the figure of Thomas Cromwell in the 16th century, born in very humble circumstances, rises to be Chancellor of England. Just because you're born on a farm now doesn't mean that you can't move to a city and become a printer or a merchant. Social hierarchies start to become more fluid. Again, think about how that affects the imagination. External authority is getting weaker. It becomes easier to believe, if you like, that external authority is a problem to be overcome rather than a given that has to be obeyed. And now let's ask that question again. In the 16th century, ask the question, who am I? It's becoming more difficult to answer because the fixed points of the 13th century, some of them have disappeared, others of them are becoming much more flexible. Just because you're born the son of a peasant doesn't mean you can't rise to be a successful merchant. Things are beginning to shift. So the move from the 13th to the 16th century, we begin to see the origins in some ways of that modern question, who am I? We can throw into that, of course, the Reformation. Now I stand before you today as a card-carrying Protestant. The Reformation is a good thing. But the Reformation undoubtedly weakens the authority of the institutional church, Catholic and Protestant. Charles Taylor's question, the statement, you cannot believe the same way today that they did in 1500 because you choose. That's starting to become a reality in the 16th century. Power is beginning to shift from church hierarchy to congregations. Luther gets this. 1520, he's saying we don't really need an ordained clergy. It's just for the sake of a bit of order. By the time we get to 1539, he's saying, no, we need an ordained clergy. That's a mark of the church. We need an ordained clergy. Because he's seen the chaos that the Reformation has unleashed. Church authority is getting weaker. You can now, by the end of the 16th century, there are places where you can kind of choose which church. You may risk persecution, of course, but religion is not a given anymore. Let's move to the third thing, life today. What can we say about life today? It's hard to point to any fixed markers today. None of those things that were fixed in 1248 are fixed today. Space. I routinely travel more in a month than anybody in the 13th century would have done. Even driving to and from work, 10 miles each way, puts me on a semi-epic journey every day by 13th century standards. Time. Time is virtually irrelevant. Now, we all get older, etc., but I'm thinking about the rhythm of life. Okay, I have to have air conditioning on in the summer and I need heating on in the winter. But life goes on the same day by day. The seasons no longer affect me as they did. Families. I live 4,000 miles away from my family. My wife and I, our oldest son, got married a few years ago, just at the end of COVID. And I remember at the wedding, there was me, my wife, my two sons. We were the only people from the family who were there. And I remember saying to my wife at the time, well, this is it, isn't it? We live on a continent of 350 million people. And there are three other people that I know I can 100% rely on. My wife and my two sons. That's not an experience anyone would have had in the 13th century. You know, that a large, elaborate family structure starts to shrink with the rise of cities in the late 15th, 16th century. Families have become, well, not only have they become much smaller, what is the definition of a family? If you put 10 people in a room and ask the definition of a family, you'll get 11 different definitions. Any definition of a family that's stable today is regarded as oppressive. Family is no longer a source of stability. Career. I've done the same job for over 30 years now. But I've done it, I think, for 6, maybe 7 different employers. I'd have to sit down and count them up at some point. And I've moved around an awful lot. My job has not given me quite the same identity and stability that it would have done in the 13th century. All of this to say, that question, who am I today, is far more complicated than it ever has been in human history, at least in the West. I make no claims here to offering a narrative that covers Asia or parts of Africa. This is a Western narrative I'm telling. In the West, who am I is now a contested question like never before. It's actually what makes me very sympathetic, if not kind of sad, for many young people today. A lot of people like to take a lot of pot shots at young people. In English, we have this phrase, snowflake, that is thrown at young people, alleging that they're sort of hypersensitive or not capable of dealing with real life. I don't like that phrase because I actually think handling real life is far more complicated for young people today than it was when I was their age. They live in a world that is so fluid. It is very, very hard for them to know who they actually are. And in that kind of circumstance, of course, new pseudo-communities and pseudo-identities move in to fill the vacuum. Some of them sexual, some of them gender. There's an intellectual narrative behind this. That's the one I lay out in my books more than I do today. But I just wanted to note that at the same time as the sort of the big social changes that I've noted are taking place, we see changes in those things that shape the imagination. The 16th century is the century in which the first person singular really explodes onto the stage in literature. I think the Frenchman Montaigne is the great exemplar of this. I'm not a Montaigne scholar, but I've got a friend who's done a lot of work in Montaigne, and he says if you do word studies as to Montaigne's use of the first person singular compared to any previous writer, there's no comparison. Montaigne just takes it to the next level. In my books I talk about Rousseau. Rousseau's the man who says, I'm going to write my life story, and all I need to do is look inside myself. I just need to go inside and tell the story of my feelings and my thoughts and my take on the world. That is my life story. He has a precedent on one level in Augustine. Augustine's Confessions. A lot of first person there, but there is a difference. Augustine's Confessions is cast as a prayer. Augustine can only ultimately make sense of himself by going outward to God. Augustine, if you like, moves inward in order to move immediately outward to God. Rousseau feels no such compunction. He just moves inward and analyzes that inner space. And we see we can also see, I think, a theological dimension to this. Martin Luther. One of Martin Luther's great insights is what? Justification by grace through faith. I think it marks a definite, improvement. Yeah, a definite improvement on the emphases of medieval theology. There's a lot of great theology in the Middle Ages, but one thing you don't find in medieval theology is that urgency for personal faith that you get in Martin Luther. But of course, in emphasizing the I, he is part of that general cultural focus on the individual that is emerging. There are other dimensions to this. We could say, if you like, that, think about Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century. It's very interesting that as Rousseau is wrestling with, his own feelings and the status that he should grant them, very same time, Jonathan Edwards is writing The Religious Affections. Edwards, too, is wrestling with the problem of how do I make sense of myself and my feelings in a context where the external authorities have been transformed or weakened or have dissolved. That emergence of the concern for that internal life. You see it across the board. It becomes very problematic, of course, in the 19th century. Friedrich Nietzsche is the great one who sort of raises the question. So in a world of flux and chaos, who is this I that we talk about? Nietzsche has a famous statement where he says, there is no doer behind the deed. There is no doer behind the deed. He's pointing there to the problem of, so what is this self, this I? In a world where everything is in flux and is crumbling, is there anything solid and continuous that allows me to talk meaningfully about myself as an agent? In the second lecture, I'm going to talk more about technology, but suffice it to note just for now that there is a strong technological component to this. I'm not one of those who reduces the Reformation to the printing press. But the printing press is a necessary precondition of the Reformation. You cannot have the Reformation as we have it without the printing press. You need cheap print. You need rising literacy rates, both of which are dependent upon the invention of the printing press. And now think about that. If the printing press disrupts so dramatically what it means to be an individual in the 16th century, one technological development transforms everything. What happens when you live in a world where there are technological developments happening one after the other with great rapidity? It's interesting, isn't it, how many articles written about artificial intelligence in the last year have raised the question, really, we could boil it down to this. What does it mean to be human anymore now we have artificial intelligence? Does it mean anything at all? Technology, very, very disruptive and disturbing relative to how we think about ourselves. There's an institutional component. As the self becomes more important, institutions get transformed. Very taken by the American political scientist Yuval Levine. Says that one of the characteristics of institutions in the modern era as opposed to past eras is this. They have ceased to be places of formation and have become places of performance, stages for performance. That example I drew earlier on about my school compared to my boys' school would be a good example. I think of graduation ceremonies. Graduated in 1988. Everybody had to dress the same, even down to the color of our socks, in order to be allowed to graduate. I break out in a rash every American graduation I go to when they desecrate their mortarboards and everybody's doing their own thing. And I want to say, no, it's not about doing your own thing. It's about becoming a faceless member of the team. That's what it's about. But think about it. Graduations have shifted from being places of, you've been formed as a member of the team. Now you will dress as a member of the team and you will go through the ritual that all the team go through. To, hey, you can dress any way you want, you can perform on stage for your graduation. You've truly become an individual. That's a very, very different philosophy of what it means to be a self, what it means to be a human being. So we might say then, to summarize what I've said so far, what has emerged in the West since the 13th century? I would say, and I'm going to return to a couple of these things in later lectures, I would say the first thing I would say, the liquid self. We don't know who we are anymore because those external things that used to anchor a sense of identity, place, family, space, time, they're now up for grabs. Secondly, I didn't do so much of this in this lecture, but I'm going to return to it in the second and third lecture, is this has led to a heavy emphasis upon the sexual nature of the human self. Why? Well, sexual desire is for most of us one of the most powerful components of life. I refuse to accept that it's a social construct. It seems to me that literature going way, way back to the Song of Solomon and beyond indicates that human sexual desire is one of the most creative and one of the most destructive aspects of being a human being. Other social constructs come and go. The erotic remains a constant, powerful force within culture, generation to generation. It seems sometimes as we look around the world today, all that is left of anything we agree on as being a human being is our sexual desires. And thirdly, as we've moved to the therapeutic, we have lost that sense of our dependence upon external authority, our dependence upon other people, our obligation towards other people, to consider ourselves increasingly isolated and autonomous. And it's to those two themes that I want to go in the next two lectures. Thank you very much.